The M4 Sherman was objectively not the best tank of World War II by most technical measures. But American factories produced approximately 49,324 of them compared to approximately 6,132 Panthers. This 8-to-1 production ratio, combined with ammunition improvements like HVAP that reduced the technical gap, proved strategically decisive. The conclusion of World War II in Europe, marked by Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945, into the immediate tactical need for HVAP ammunition against Panthers. American ordnance officers systematically examining destroyed vehicles in the war's aftermath found clear evidence of HVAP penetrations on some wrecks, confirming the ammunition's effectiveness under favorable conditions while noting its limitations. Panthers hit by HVAP typically showed penetrations through the mantlet or turret face when struck at favorable angles, but rarely through the glassy plate, which remained highly resistant even to tungsten carbide penetrators at high velocity. This pattern validated American tactical doctrine that emphasized flanking maneuvers and creating favorable engagement angles rather than relying purely on ammunition performance. The comprehensive post-war analysis conducted by American and British technical intelligence teams concluded that while HVAP meaningfully improved Sherman capabilities against heavy German armor, the truly decisive factors in the Allied victory remained overwhelming numerical superiority, vastly better logistics, complete air superiority, superior artillery support, and more effective operational doctrine. The transformation of American tank crews from mid-1944 to early 1945 reflected the cumulative impact of combat experience, improved equipment availability, and familiarity with specialized ammunition, including HVAP. Crews that landed in Normandy in June 1944 often felt genuinely apprehensive about facing German armor, particularly Panthers and Tigers that seemed nearly invincible. By early 1945, after months of sustained combat, significant training improvements, increased availability of 76mm Shermans, and growing familiarity with HVAP ammunition, American tankers approached engagements far more confidently. They had learned that Panthers could be defeated, that the right tactics and ammunition could overcome technical disadvantages, that skilled crews in supposedly inferior tanks could prevail against superior equipment poorly employed. This psychological shift had direct tactical consequences that influenced every engagement in the war's final months. Confident crews fought more aggressively, took calculated risks when opportunities appeared, and exploited tactical advantages that more hesitant crews might have missed. While HVAP ammunition alone did not create this transformation, its availability and proven effectiveness contributed meaningfully to improved American armored force morale and tactical performance. The legacy of HVAP development continues influencing modern ammunition design in ways that demonstrate the enduring relevance of World War II innovations. American armor doctrine from 1945 onward consistently emphasized ammunition effectiveness as a critical component of tank design, recognition that the projectile matters as much as the gun firing it or the armor protecting the crew. Modern tank ammunition uses depleted uranium or tungsten alloy penetrators, materials chosen for essentially the same density and hardness properties that made tungsten carbide effective in World War II. The underlying principle remains constant across 8 decades of development. Concentrate maximum kinetic energy into a small, extremely dense projectile moving at the highest achievable velocity. The continuity from 1944 HVAP to present-day armor-piercing fin-stabilized, discarding sabot ammunition illustrates how foundational lessons from World War II continue directly influencing military technology. Engineers in the 1940s established principles that remain valid in the 21st century because the physics of armor penetration hasn't changed. Only the specific materials and velocities have improved. September 19, 1944, when First Lieutenant Merwin Min's Sherman crews first engaged Panthers with HVAP ammunition at Arracourt, marked a genuine turning point in the psychological balance of armored warfare. German crews who had fought confidently behind their armor learned that American tanks could pose a serious frontal threat. American crews who had felt outmatched gained meaningful confidence from knowing they possessed ammunition that could defeat Panthers under favorable circumstances. This shift in tactical psychology, enabled by tungsten carbide ammunition produced in American factories and distributed to frontline units despite severe material constraints, influenced every subsequent armored engagement of the European War. The psychological transformation mattered as much as the technical capability. Men who believe they can win fight differently than men who believe they're outmatched. HVAP ammunition, though never available in desired quantities, provided enough improved capability to transform American tank crews from uncertain defenders into confident attackers willing to engage German armor directly. The crews who fired those first HVAP rounds in combat, watching tungsten cores punch through armor that had seemed invincible, demonstrated that industrial capacity and material science applied intelligently to urgent tactical problems could overcome seemingly insurmountable technical disadvantages. Lieutenant Min survived the Battle of Arracourt. His Sherman, one of the first to fire HVAP in anger, fought through to Germany and was there when the morning fog lay thick across the French countryside near Arracourt, clinging to the ground like a living thing. Inside his Sherman tank, First Lieutenant Merwin Min gripped the turret rim with both hands, feeling the cold metal bite through his gloves. September 19, 1944. The air smelled of wet earth, engine oil, and something else, the metallic scent that always came before battle. His gunner, Corporal James Riley, peered through the periscope, scanning the mist-shrouded terrain ahead. They'd been warned about Panthers. Everyone had been warned about Panthers. The formidable German tanks with their sloped armor had become the stuff of nightmares for Sherman crews across France. Men had heard the stories, 75mm rounds bouncing off like pebbles, Panthers destroying Shermans from distances where American guns couldn't even penetrate. But tucked into their ammunition rack, hidden among the standard rounds, were 6 projectiles that would change everything. 6 M93 high-velocity, armor-piercing rounds. Each one contained a tungsten carbide core, a piece of industrial wizardry that could transform their medium Sherman from prey into predator. Min's crew didn't fully understand the science behind these special rounds. They only knew what the briefing officer had told them. Use them wisely, against Panther turrets or mantlets, at ranges where velocity stays high. What Min and his crew were about to discover was that the psychological impact of this ammunition would prove just as devastating as its penetrating power. They were about to shatter German assumptions about American tank capabilities and force a complete reassessment of Panther invulnerability. The story of how this specialized ammunition altered the balance of armored warfare begins not on the battlefields of France, but in the testing grounds and industrial facilities of the United States, where metallurgists and ballistic engineers worked against time to solve a problem that threatened to undermine American armored operations in Europe. In early 1944, the United States Army faced a crisis that military planners had catastrophically failed to anticipate. The M4 Sherman tank, the backbone of American armor divisions, was encountering German tanks it could not reliably defeat from the front. The Panther, Germany's answer to the Soviet T-34, combined a powerful 75mm high-velocity gun with an 80mm glassy plate sloped at 55 degrees. This created an effective thickness of approximately 140mm that proved nearly impenetrable to American tank guns. The intelligence failures were staggering. American planners had underestimated both the quantity and quality of Panthers that would be deployed in France. By June 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, 38% of German tanks in the theater were Panthers. Not the handful predicted in pre-invasion assessments, but hundreds of these advanced medium tanks. Often they were crewed by inexperienced soldiers rushed through abbreviated training, but they were protected by armor that conventional American tank guns simply could not penetrate frontally. The mathematics of death were brutal and simple. The 75mm M3 gun that armed most Shermans in Normandy could not penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at any range. The round would simply ricochet off the sloped glassy plate, leaving the Sherman crew vulnerable to return fire from the Panther's powerful gun, which could destroy a Sherman from over 2,000 meters away. Sherman crews learned to fear the distinctive sound of a Panther's gun, a sharp crack that echoed across the hedgerows, usually followed by the screaming impact of a shell that could punch through a Sherman's armor like tissue paper. Even the improved 76mm M1 gun, which began reaching American units in July 1944, struggled desperately against Panther armor. Using standard M62 armor-piercing capped rounds, the 76mm could penetrate 109mm of armor at 1,000 meters at 0 degrees obliquity. This was sufficient against the Panzer IV and many German assault guns, weapons the Americans have been expecting to face. But the Panther's sloped frontal armor remained effectively immune. The 76mm could penetrate the Panther's gun mantlet, that curved piece of cast steel protecting the gun breech, but only at extremely close range, typically under 100 meters. This was a distance at which the Panther's overwhelming advantages in firepower made engagement suicidal. The problem wasn't the gun itself. The 76mm was a capable weapon, well-designed and reliable. The problem was the ammunition it fired. Standard armor-piercing rounds simply lacked the velocity and penetrating power needed to defeat the Panther's sophisticated armor scheme. The deployment of the 76mm gun itself had been a saga of bureaucratic hesitation and belated recognition that would haunt American armored forces. The first M4 Shermans mounting the 76mm M1 gun had rolled off production lines in January 1944, months before the Normandy invasion. These M4A1 76 Shermans arrived in Britain on April 10, 1944, with 130 tanks delivered specifically to prepare for the coming invasion. They sat in British ports and depots, available and ready. Yet despite their availability, despite the clear need for improved firepower, American commanders refused to deploy these improved tanks on D-Day. The reasons were multiple and would later seem inexplicable to the men who paid for these decisions with their lives. Crews lacked adequate training time on the new weapon system. The 76mm handled differently than the 75mm, required different fire control techniques, different ammunition handling procedures. Logistical officers worried about maintaining two different ammunition types in the supply chain, fearing it would complicate supply planning and create shortages. Most critically, commanders believed the 75mm gun would prove adequate for the expected opposition. Intelligence assessments suggested the Germans would defend Normandy with older Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs, tanks the 75mm could handle. This proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation that would cost hundreds of American lives. By early July 1944, field reports from Normandy painted a grim and undeniable picture. Sherman crews were being slaughtered. On July 2nd, urgent complaints about the 75mm gun's ineffectiveness against German armor reached General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied. A board convened on July 12, 1944, officially determined what tank crews already knew from bitter, bloody experience. Standard American weapons could not defeat Panthers frontally. The technical data was unambiguous. The combat reports were consistent. American armor was outmatched by German engineers. The real solution lay not in the gun barrel, but in the projectile traveling through it. The answer was metallurgy and physics, the application of industrial chemistry to the ancient problem of punching through armor. By July 1944, American ordnance engineers had developed the T4 round, later standardized as the M93 HVAP, high-velocity, armor-piercing ammunition. This projectile represented a fundamental departure from conventional armor-piercing design, a leap forward in the science of destroying tanks. The projectile consisted of a tungsten carbide core, one of the hardest materials available to American industry, surrounded by a lightweight aluminum body and ballistic windshield. The design was elegant in its efficiency. By using a dense, hard core inside a lightweight carrier, engineers concentrated the projectile's kinetic energy into a smaller, denser penetrator while reducing overall weight. Less weight meant higher velocity. Higher velocity meant more kinetic energy delivered to the target. More kinetic energy meant better penetration. The results were dramatic, almost unbelievable to crews who had spent months watching their rounds bounce off German armor. The M93 round achieved a muzzle velocity of 1,036 meters per second, compared to 792 meters per second for the standard M62 round. This 244 meters per second velocity increase translated directly into penetrating power. At 1,000 yards, approximately 914 meters, the HVAP round could penetrate 160 millimeters of armor at 10 degrees obliquity. Against the Panther's gun mantlet, with its curved 100 millimeters thick cast steel on early OSF-D and a variants, later increased to 120 millimeters on the OSF-G. This meant reliable penetration at ranges up to 1,000 meters instead of point-blank distance. The mantlet, that necessary weak point where the gun had to protrude from the turret, suddenly became a viable target for Sherman crews who had previously been forced to attempt desperate flank attacks or retreat. But the development of HVAP represented only half the solution. Actually producing these rounds in meaningful quantities was another matter entirely, one that would test American industrial capacity and resource management. The T4 round depended on tungsten carbide, a strategic material imported primarily from China, which produced 36% of global tungsten supply before the war. Tungsten was critical to numerous war industries. Machine tools needed tungsten for cutting bits that could shape hardened steel. Armor-piercing ammunition from multiple calibers required it. Armor plate hardening processes used it. Various industrial processes across the American war economy competed for limited supplies. American tungsten demand for HVAP ammunition alone consumed hundreds of metric tons annually. Each 76mm HVAP round contained approximately 0.88 kilograms of tungsten carbide, meaning a Sherman carrying 6 rounds required nearly 5 kilograms of this scarce material. Multiply that by thousands of tanks, and the material requirements became staggering. China produced approximately 10,000 metric tons of tungsten concentrates in 1944, but this had to serve all Allied needs across all applications. The United States supplemented Chinese imports with domestic production from limited deposits in Colorado, Nevada, and California, but total availability remained severely constrained. Every kilogram of tungsten used for tank ammunition was a kilogram unavailable for machine tools, aircraft components, or other critical applications. Germany's tungsten position was far worse. Swedish imports declined sharply as the war turned against the Reich, and neutral Sweden became less willing to trade with a losing power. German domestic production remained minimal. By 1945, German factories desperately hoarded tungsten for machine tools needed for aircraft engine production, while Panther crews received only standard ammunition. German engineers knew how to make tungsten-cored ammunition. They had developed their own Panzergranate 40 series, but they simply didn't have the material to produce it in quantity. The United States Ordnance Department had been testing HVAP projectiles since spring 1942, recognizing early in the war that conventional armor-piercing rounds might prove insufficient against future enemy armor. But production at scale did not begin until after the Normandy landings revealed the full extent of the Panther problem. In July 1944, production of 3-inch HVAP rounds for tank destroyers reached 1,000 rounds. August saw 1,000 rounds of 76mm HVAP produced. September yielded another 1,076mm rounds. These were pitifully small numbers compared to the need. Thousands of tanks in the field, each requiring rounds that could only be produced in the hundreds. Not until November 1944 did monthly production reach 5,000 rounds for the 76mm gun, ramping to 7,000 rounds per month by January 1945. By March 1945, approximately 33,000 rounds of 76mm HVAP ammunition had been produced, a significant industrial effort representing millions of dollars and countless hours of skilled labor, but still a fraction of what was needed. The allocation statistics were grim. By February 1945, the average 76mm Sherman in Europe had received a total of 5 HVAP rounds. 5 rounds to face an enemy deploying Panthers as the standard tank in Panzer divisions. A Sherman company with 17 tanks would possess 85 HVAP rounds total while facing German units that might field 30 or more Panthers. The arithmetic of survival was brutal. The first HVAP rounds reached the European theater in August 1944, shipped across the Atlantic in the holds of cargo vessels, distributed through supply depots, and finally delivered to tank units in the field. But their arrival was overshadowed by broader tactical problems that made the ammunition's potential difficult to realize. The Normandy hedgerows, the bocage, had forced American armor into close-quarters combat, where superior German guns could ambush Sherman columns. Tank crews faced an enemy who had learned to position Panthers in hull-down positions, exposing only the heavily armored turret, while keeping the more vulnerable hull hidden behind terrain. German doctrine emphasized first-shot capability, with Panthers waiting in prepared positions, allowing Sherman columns to approach before opening fire from ranges where American return fire was ineffective. The psychological impact on American tank crews was severe and cumulative. Men watched their friends burn. They saw tanks brewing up, the tanker's euphemism for the catastrophic ammunition fires that could consume a Sherman in seconds. Crews nicknamed the Sherman the Ronson Lighter, claiming it lit every time. While post-war analysis showed this reputation was exaggerated, Shermans were no more prone to fire than other tanks when penetrated. The perception shaped behavior. The first widespread combat test of HVAP ammunition came not in Normandy's claustrophobic hedgerows, but in the open country of Lorraine, where American armored divisions had broken out into terrain that favored German defensive tactics, but also allowed American advantages in mobility and combined arms to manifest. September 1944 found Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army deep in France, racing toward the German border with logistics stretched to the breaking point. The 4th Armored Division, one of the most effective American armored formations in the European theater, had advanced aggressively, seizing a bridgehead over the Moselle River near Arracourt. It was a dagger pointed at Germany's industrial heart. German high command recognized the threat immediately. The German force assembled for this attack included 2 newly formed Panzer brigades, the 111th and 113th, equipped primarily with Panther tanks fresh from German factories. These were not the veteran units that had fought in Russia or Italy. These were new formations, hastily organized, with crews that had minimal training. But they had Panthers, and German commanders believed that would be enough. On paper, the German advantage appeared overwhelming. The 2 brigades together fielded approximately 150 tanks against Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, which possessed roughly 50 Sherman tanks. The 113th Panzer Brigade alone entered battle with approximately 90 tanks and assault guns in both battalions combined, including 42 Panthers and 40 Panzer IVs. German planners anticipated a rapid victory. The Panthers' technical superiority should compensate for any American advantages in logistics or air support. They had the better tanks. They had favorable defensive terrain. They would destroy the American bridgehead and restore the front. They were fundamentally mistaken about the nature of modern warfare. The Battle of Arracourt, fought over 11 days from September 18th to 29th, would become the largest tank engagement fought by American forces until the Battle of the Bulge 3 months later. More importantly, it would demonstrate that American tank crews, properly trained and equipped with HVAP ammunition, could defeat technically superior German armor through superior tactics, combined arms coordination, and the judicious use of high-velocity armor-piercing rounds. The morning of September 19th began with thick fog blanketing the rolling terrain around Arracourt. German reconnaissance was limited. The Panzer brigades, lacking proper scouting units, advanced blindly into terrain held by American forces who knew the ground and had established defensive positions overnight. At approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade penetrated American outposts east and south of Arracourt. The German tanks, factory new Panthers with inexperienced crews moved forward in column formation, a fundamental tactical error that veteran American tankers immediately recognized and exploited. Captain Kenneth R. Lameson's C Company, 37th Tank Battalion, held positions along key approaches to Arracourt. His Sherman crews had been briefed on the HVAP rounds in their ammunition racks the night before. 6 rounds per tank. The briefing officer had been explicit. Use them wisely. Against Panther turrets or mantlets. At ranges where velocity remains sufficient for penetration. Lameson's gunner, a veteran sergeant named Frank Morrison, had asked the obvious question. What's sufficient for penetration, sir? Under 1,000 meters. The closer, the better. Under 500, you'll punch through the mantlet every time if you hit it square. Now, in the fog-shrouded dawn, that briefing was about to be tested. The fog that hindered German reconnaissance now worked in favor of American defenders. A section of Lameson's Shermans occupied positions south of the village when the first Panther materialized from the mist like a ghost ship emerging from clouds. The range was barely 75 meters. The German tank commander had his hatch open, standing partially exposed, peering forward into the fog. At this range, the Panther's superior long-range gunnery meant nothing. The American gunner didn't wait for orders. His training took over, target identification, range estimation, ammunition selection. He loaded HVAP after the morning briefing. Now he laid his sight on the Panther's mantlet, that curved shield protecting the gun breech. On the way, he announced the standard firing warning. The 76mm gun cracked. The HVAP round, traveling at over 1,000 meters per second, struck the Panther's gun mantlet with devastating precision. The tungsten carbide core, harder than the steel it struck, punched through the curved cast steel and detonated the ammunition stored directly beneath the gun breech. The Panther exploded. Not a simple fire, but a catastrophic detonation. The turret lifted slightly from the force of the secondary explosion, ammunition cooking off in a chain reaction. Flame and smoke erupted from every hatch. The German tank commander, who had been standing in his hatch, simply disappeared in the blast. 2 more Panthers emerged from the fog in quick succession, drawn by the sound of the explosion. The American Shermans were ready. Both German tanks were destroyed within seconds, their crews having no time to effectively return fire in the limited visibility. The tungsten rounds punched through mantlets and turret faces, finding ammunition, fuel, crew. The remaining German tanks turned away, crews shocked by the sudden loss of 3 Panthers to what they had been told were inferior American tanks. The radio chatter was frantic, confused. American tanks have new guns. They're penetrating frontally. Request artillery support. But there was no artillery support. The German panzer brigades had advanced without adequate artillery coordination. They had assumed the Panthers would be enough. Throughout the morning of September 19th, similar engagements erupted across the Arracourt sector. American tanks, using the fog as concealment, engaged Panthers at ranges where HVAP rounds were most effective. The German tactical deployment proved disastrous. Advancing in column without proper reconnaissance, Panther crews repeatedly exposed their thinner side armor to American flanking fire. Near Arracourt's command post, a platoon of M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, also equipped with 76mm guns and HVAP ammunition, engaged German armor at close range. The Hellcat was lightly armored but exceptionally fast, capable of speeds up to 55 miles per hour on roads. In the close-range, fog-shrouded combat, these fast-moving tank destroyers proved devastatingly effective. They would appear from the mist, fire, and disappear before German crews could react. By noon, as the fog lifted, the full weight of American combined arms doctrine began to manifest. American forward artillery observers, positioned with the tank companies, could now coordinate fire with defending units. The skies cleared enough for P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers of the 405th Fighter Group to arrive overhead, diving through gaps in the clouds to strike German armor with rockets and machine guns. The combination of American advantages became overwhelmingly clear. While the Panther possessed superior armor and firepower as an individual weapon system, American forces employed combined arms tactics as standard doctrine. German tanks advanced without adequate artillery support, without air cover, without infantry to clear American defensive positions. They were fighting 20th century warfare with 19th century tactics. American forces coordinated armor with artillery, air power, infantry, and tank destroyers in an integrated system that overwhelmed German technical advantages. When Panthers encountered these prepared defenses, they were destroyed piecemeal despite their superior capabilities. The HVAP ammunition did not make Sherman tanks equal to Panthers in technical specifications. A Panther still had better armor, a more powerful gun, superior optics. But warfare is not conducted according to technical specifications alone. Tanks are destroyed by crews who exploit vulnerabilities under combat conditions, who use the first Panther commanders to watch Sherman rounds punch through their mantlets and detonate ready ammunition learned otherwise. Those who survived such encounters, and many didn't, carried that knowledge back to their units, spreading awareness that American tanks now possessed ammunition capable of defeating Panthers. By the afternoon of September 19th, German tank commanders were reporting to headquarters that American Shermans possessed new, more powerful ammunition. The reports were confused and contradictory. Some claimed the Americans had secretly deployed tank destroyers with 90mm guns. Others suggested the British had provided 17-pounder Firefly tanks to American units, those deadly Sherman variants mounting British guns that could reliably kill Panthers. The truth, that American industry had developed specialized ammunition that partially negated the Panthers' armor advantage, was more troubling to German planners than any of these theories. It meant that American industrial capacity could respond to tactical problems faster than German industry could counter them. It meant the material superiority that was slowly crushing Germany on all fronts had found yet another expression on the battlefield. The fighting continued through September 22nd, when a major German offensive efforts finally stalled. The tally was brutal for the attackers. American forces had destroyed or disabled approximately 86 German tanks and assault guns. American losses stood at 25 Sherman tanks and 7 tank destroyers. The kill ratio heavily favored the Americans despite their technical disadvantage in individual tank performance. This shouldn't have been possible according to German calculations. Panthers were superior tanks, yet they had been destroyed at a ratio of more than 3-1. The Battle of Arracourt represented not just a tactical victory, but a psychological watershed. American tank crews learned that they could defeat Panthers without waiting for specialized tank destroyers or overwhelming air support. They had the tools, HVAP ammunition, combined arms coordination, superior training. German crews lost the psychological security of believing in absolute frontal invulnerability. That confidence, that sense of superiority, once broken, could never be fully restored. The German perspective on Arracourt was one of confusion and bitter recrimination. The 113th Panzer Brigade, which had entered battle with approximately 90 tanks and assault guns, could muster fewer than 20 operational vehicles by September 29th. The 111th Panzer Brigade had suffered similarly catastrophic losses. German after-action reports struggled to explain the defeat. The technical superiority of the Panther was undeniable on paper. How had inexperienced crews in newly produced tanks been defeated so comprehensively by supposedly inferior American armor? The answers lay partly in training and experience. The Panzer Brigade crews had minimal training, often arriving at the front with only weeks of instruction in their tanks. Some drivers had fewer than 50 hours of actual driving time. Gunners had fired only a handful of practice rounds. Radio operators barely understood their equipment. American tank crews in the 4th Armored Division were veterans who had fought across France since Normandy. They understood combined arms warfare instinctively. They knew how to read terrain for tactical advantage, how to coordinate with infantry and artillery, how to exploit enemy mistakes. But training alone did not fully explain Panther losses, particularly the penetrations that should not have been possible with standard American ammunition. German intelligence officers examining destroyed Panthers found entry holes smaller than expected, suggesting a subcaliber projectile, something other than a standard armor-piercing round. Examination of unexploded rounds recovered near disabled tanks revealed the truth. The Americans had deployed tungsten carbide ammunition, HVAP rounds, identical in concept to Germany's own Panzergranate 40. This discovery had profound strategic implications. Germany itself had developed similar ammunition precisely because German engineers understood the physics of armor penetration. Tungsten cores improved penetration dramatically, but German tungsten supplies were critically limited by late 1944, with production focused on machine tools rather than ammunition. If Americans could field specialized tungsten carbide ammunition in quantity sufficient to distribute to frontline tank units, it demonstrated industrial capacity and resource access that Germany could not match. American tanks were more numerous, better supported logistically, operating under complete air superiority. And now they were equipped with ammunition that partially negated Germany's carefully engineered technical advantages in armor protection. The realization was devastating for German planners who understood the implications. Not only were American forces overwhelming Germany with sheer numbers, they were also solving technical problems faster than Germany could create them. The war of material production, the Industrial War, was being won decisively by the Allies. The impact of HVAP ammunition extended far beyond the immediate tactical results at Arracourt. As word spread through American armored units that the new ammunition could defeat Panthers under favorable circumstances, tank crews became more willing to engage German armor directly. The psychological paralysis that had affected some units during the difficult Normandy fighting began to dissipate. Crews still respected the Panthers' capabilities. They weren't suicidal, but they no longer felt helpless against it. This shift in morale proved crucial for subsequent operations. A crew that believes it can fight will engage aggressively, seeking advantageous positions and taking calculated risks. A crew that believes it is outmatched will hesitate, ceding initiative to the enemy. HVAP ammunition, though in critically short supply, provided American tankers with a weapon that allowed them to fight Panthers on more equal terms. Even crews that had never fired an HVAP round benefited psychologically from knowing the ammunition existed and might be available when most needed. The mere knowledge that penetration was possible changed behavior, made men bolder, improved their tactical performance. But the scarcity of HVAP created difficult command decisions. Commanders were forced to make allocation choices that could mean the difference between victory and defeat, between crews living and dying. Tank destroyers, whose mission focused specifically on anti-tank combat, received preferential allocation. This made tactical sense. Tank destroyers existed to kill tanks, so they should receive the best anti-tank ammunition. Sherman tanks, with their dual role of supporting infantry and engaging armor, often received fewer rounds despite encountering enemy tanks more frequently. This created operational tension between tactical needs and supply realities. The allocation system, managed at multiple command levels from Army down to battalion, resulted in inevitable inefficiencies. Some units received more HVAP than they could immediately use, while others exhausted their supply within days and received no resupply despite urgent requests. Battalion supply officers made agonizing decisions about which companies to prioritize. Company commanders decided which platoons to favor. Platoon leaders determined which individual tanks would carry HVAP. The whole system was imperfect, inefficient, frustrating to the men whose lives depended on having the right ammunition at the right moment. When German forces launched their surprise offensive in the Ardennes in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, American tank units faced renewed, intense pressure. The German attack, launched through a weakly defended sector in terrible weather, achieved complete tactical surprise. Hundreds of Panthers and Tiger tanks deployed in winter conditions that favored defensive fighting and limited Allied air superiority due to poor weather. American Sherman crews relied heavily on their scarce HVAP ammunition to engage German heavy armor in the desperate fighting. The shortage became critical within days. Some units exhausted their HVAP supply completely and found resupply requests going unfulfilled as logistical networks struggled to deliver ammunition through snow-blocked roads disrupted by German advances. Yet, even in the difficult fighting of the Ardennes, American forces demonstrated that tactical skill and combined arms coordination could compensate for technical disadvantage. Tank crews coordinated closely with infantry, using bazooka teams to disable Panthers from close range while Shermans provided covering fire. Artillery forward observers called in time-on-target missions that damaged optics, disabled tracks, and killed exposed crew members even when shells could not penetrate armor. Air support, when weather finally permitted in late December and January, proved devastatingly effective against German armor concentrated on approach roads. P-47s and P-51s armed with rockets and bombs destroyed Panthers by the dozens, catching them in road columns where they couldn't maneuver. The Battle of the Bulge ended with German armored forces shattered, having lost hundreds of irreplaceable tanks and experienced crews in an offensive that failed to reach its objectives. The Panther, for all its technical excellence, could not overcome American material superiority and tactical competence. By early 1945, the strategic picture had shifted decisively and irreversibly in Allied favor. American and British forces were preparing to cross the Rhine. Soviet armies were advancing from the east, having shattered German defensive lines in massive winter offensives. Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing under combined strategic bombing, loss of territory containing critical resources and manufacturing facilities, and severe shortages of raw materials, including fuel and tungsten. Panther production, which had reached 3,900 units in 1944, fell sharply in early 1945 as factories were bombed, transportation networks disrupted, and raw materials became unavailable. Even when Panthers were produced, fuel shortages often kept them immobile. German tank units in the final months frequently abandoned tanks, not because of combat damage, but because they had no fuel to operate them. The technical limitations of HVAP, while less publicized than its successes, deserve examination for historical completeness. The tungsten carbide core, while excellent at penetrating armor when conditions were favorable, was inherently brittle. Below certain impact velocities, approximately 2,300 to 2,500 feet per second, the core could shatter on contact rather than penetrating. This meant that HVAP effectiveness declined significantly at longer ranges where velocity had decreased. The effective range against Panther mantlets was approximately 1,000 meters. Beyond this distance, the probability of the core shattering on impact increased substantially. American tankers learned these limitations through combat experience, sometimes tragically. Crews that fired HVAP at Panthers beyond effective range wasted scarce ammunition and often provoked return fire from German guns that remained effective at much longer ranges. Training on proper HVAP employment was often minimal, as the ammunition arrived at frontline units faster than training materials could be developed and distributed. Many crews learned effective employment techniques through trial and error under combat conditions, the hardest school of all. Sergeant Francis Baker's documented experience on November 20th, 1944, illustrated both the potential and limitations of HVAP in actual combat. His Sherman, equipped with a 76mm gun and carrying HVAP rounds, engaged a Panther at approximately 800 yards. Baker's gunner fired at least 7 rounds with multiple hits observed on the Panther side armor. To Baker's frustration, the rounds bounced off without achieving penetration. The engagement demonstrated that even HVAP had significant limits against sloped armor at oblique angles. The Panther withdrew from the engagement rather than continuing the fight, so the action was not a complete tactical failure. The German crew had been rattled enough to break contact. But it reminded Sherman crews that HVAP was not a magical solution. Proper tactics, careful shot placement, favorable range estimation, and advantageous angles of engagement remained critical factors. HVAP gave American tankers significantly better odds, but success still required skill and judgment. The post-war analysis of HVAP ammunition revealed both its successes and limitations with scientific precision. Against the Panther's gun mantlet at ranges up to 1,000 meters, HVAP was highly effective when hits were achieved, reliably penetrating and often causing catastrophic secondary explosions as tungsten cores found ammunition stowage. Against the glassy plate, results were poor except at very close ranges and favorable angles. The extreme slope meant that tungsten carbide rounds traveling at high velocity often ricocheted or shattered on impact. The physics worked against penetration. Even the hardest penetrator couldn't overcome geometry when the angle was too severe. This meant Sherman crews still needed to maneuver for advantageous shot angles, flanking Panthers when tactically possible. The ammunition did not make Sherman tanks technical equals to Panthers. It did not eliminate the need for tactical skill, but it gave American crews a fighting chance in engagements where previously they had little hope of frontal penetration. The Korean War, beginning in June 1950, provided another combat test of HVAP effectiveness in a very different context. The T-34/85, while capable and well-designed, possessed armor protection significantly inferior to the Panther. Its 90 mm thick turret front and 45 mm thick glassy plate could not resist tungsten carbide projectiles fired at high velocity from 76 mm. The German perspective on American HVAP ammunition, gathered from post-war interrogations and examination of capture documents, revealed grudging professional respect mixed with deep frustration. German ordnance officers recognized that American industry had solved the tungsten core ammunition problem more successfully than German manufacturers, despite Germany having pioneered the underlying technology. While Germany had developed tungsten carbide ammunition with the Panzergranate 40 series, production limitations meant these rounds were never available in sufficient quantities to influence battlefield outcomes meaningfully. By late 1944, German tungsten was reserved almost exclusively for machine tools needed to produce aircraft engines. The Luftwaffe's jets and advanced fighters required precision machining that only tungsten-tipped tools could provide. Ammunition production had to make do with conventional materials. American production of HVAP, though also limited by tungsten scarcity, still exceeded German capability substantially by late 1944. The United States had access to Chinese tungsten imports, domestic production from Western mines, and an industrial infrastructure that could efficiently convert raw materials into finished ammunition. Germany had none of these advantages by the war's final year. German tank crews interviewed after the war frequently mentioned American ammunition improvements as a significant factor that complicated their tactical situation in the final months of fighting. The knowledge that Sherman tanks could penetrate Panther mantlets at combat ranges meant German crews could no longer simply rely on frontal armor for protection. This forced more cautious tactics, slower advances, and greater reliance on defensive positions. But defensive warfare ceded initiative to American forces, allowing them to employ combined arms tactics that negated German advantages. Panthers waiting in defensive positions could be bypassed, isolated, and destroyed by artillery or airstrikes. The aggressive armored warfare that had characterized German successes in 1940 and 1941 was no longer possible. The psychological impact of losing armor and vulnerability contributed to the increasingly defensive mindset that characterized German armored operations in 1945. Panther crews who had once advanced confidently, trusting in their armor's protection, now moved cautiously, constantly aware that American tanks might penetrate their defenses. Fear changes behavior, erodes aggression, makes men hesitant. An army that fights defensively from fear rather than calculation has already lost the initiative that wins battles. Technical analysis of HVAP projectiles recovered from German tank wrecks provided German engineers with detailed understanding of American ammunition design. The tungsten carbide core, surrounded by lightweight aluminum body sections, represented efficient use of scarce strategic materials that maximized penetrating power while minimizing tungsten consumption per round. The lightweight carrier body allowed higher velocities without excessive barrel wear, while the dense tungsten core retained kinetic energy over distance far better than steel penetrators. German engineers recognized these advantages immediately. The design was elegant, efficient, exactly what German ammunition should have been if materials had been available. But they lacked the industrial capacity and material resources to respond with similar developments. By late 1944, German tank and ammunition production focused entirely on maintaining output of existing designs rather than developing new ammunition types. Factories operated under constant air attack, with workers sheltering in bunkers between shifts, production lines relocated to caves and tunnels, raw materials arriving sporadically if at all. The Panther's KWK 42 75mm gun already possessed excellent penetrating power with standard ammunition against Allied tanks. So developing improved German rounds was not the critical priority when resources were so constrained. The gun could defeat any Allied tank from the front at reasonable ranges. The problem was that Allied tanks now had ammunition that could fight back effectively. Developing new ammunition would require tungsten. Germany could not spare, and retooling that factories struggling under air attack could not accommodate. German tanks in the final year fought with ammunition designs dating to 1942 and 1943, while American ammunition continued improving month by month as industry responded to combat feedback. The Battle of Arracourt's historical significance extended far beyond immediate tactical results or the performance of specific ammunition types. The engagement proved conclusively that American armored doctrine, emphasizing mobility, combined arms coordination, superior logistics, and overwhelming material support, could consistently defeat German tactical methods that relied heavily on superior individual tank performance. German commanders had designed their 1944 Panzer brigades around the Panthers' technical capabilities, assuming armor and firepower would compensate for inexperienced crews and limited support. This assumption, born from earlier successes when German technical superiority had been more pronounced, proved catastrophically false in the changed conditions of late 1944. The lesson was clear to military observers on both sides, though it would take time for the full implications to be absorbed. Technical excellence in weapons design mattered and provided real advantages on the battlefield. But operational excellence in combined arms warfare, superior logistics, better training, and the ability to concentrate forces at decisive points mattered more for achieving tactical and operational success. A technically superior tank operated by a poorly trained crew, without adequate support, advancing into prepared defenses, will be destroyed. A technically inferior tank operated by a skilled crew, supported by artillery and air power, fighting from advantageous positions, will survive and prevail. The mathematics of modern warfare had shifted from individual weapon performance to systemic integration of all combat arms. The impact of HVAP on individual tank crews deserves consideration beyond purely technical analysis. For American tankers who had faced Panthers with only standard ammunition during the difficult Normandy fighting, the arrival of HVAP represented tangible hope. Physical proof that someone understood their problems and was working to solve them. The ammunition did not eliminate the Panther threat. It did not make Shermans invulnerable or guarantee survival, but it provided a tool that offered reasonable chances of achieving penetration under favorable circumstances. This psychological boost, this restoration of hope, contributed to improved performance and more aggressive tactics. Men fight better when they believe they can win. They take necessary risks, press advantages, maintain offensive spirit even when facing superior enemy equipment. HVAP gave American tankers that belief, that confidence that they weren't simply targets waiting to be destroyed by an enemy they couldn't hurt. For German tankers, The knowledge that American tanks now posed a credible frontal threat fundamentally altered tactical calculations in ways that went beyond immediate combat effectiveness. The sense of invulnerability that thick armor provided was crucial to crew morale and aggressive tactics. Knowing you're protected allows you to focus on destroying the enemy rather than worrying about your own survival. When that sense eroded, when crews began to fear that American tanks could penetrate their armor, performance suffered measurably. Otto Carius, a highly decorated German tank ace who commanded Tiger tanks and survived the war, wrote extensively in his post-war memoirs about the psychological impact of facing enemies who could penetrate his armor. The mantlet became a known vulnerability that competent American crews could exploit with HVAP ammunition. This knowledge made Panther crews demonstrably more cautious, slower to engage, and generally less willing to take tactical risks. A Panther crew that advanced cautiously, worried about incoming fire, was less effective than a crew that advanced confidently, focused solely on engaging enemy targets. The strategic implications of HVAP development extend to broader questions about technological competition in modern warfare and the crucial importance of industrial capacity. Both American and German research establishments possessed competent engineers and sophisticated understanding of ballistics and armor penetration. Both recognized the value of tungsten carbide ammunition early in the war. Both developed functional designs that worked as intended. The critical difference came down to industrial capacity and resource availability rather than scientific knowledge or engineering skill. American industry could produce HVAP in quantities sufficient to influence battlefield outcomes meaningfully, though never enough to fully equip all units as commanders desired. German industry could barely produce enough rounds to conduct testing and limited trials. This pattern repeated across numerous weapon systems throughout the war. Germany developed sophisticated and often technically superior weapons: the Panther, the Tiger, the Me-262 jet fighter, the Type XXI submarine, but could not produce them in quantities that affected strategic outcomes. American industrial capacity produced less sophisticated but highly effective equipment in overwhelming numbers.